I would have hoped. Now, we turn our attention to the fiscal knife edge. At last, I hear you cry. Which fiscal rules are going to be necessary if green, inclusive economic growth is going to be a core policy objective for the UK? Is the government making the right choices and choosing the best trade-offs? Because there's always going to have to be a trade-off, isn't there? What position can local government, and for that matter, businesses themselves, take in response? I'd like to welcome to the stage your chair for the next session, Dr. Linda Yueh, economist at the University of Oxford, the London Business School, and foreign policy think tank LSE Ideas. She will be joined by Stephanie Flanders, Senior Executive Editor for Government and Economics and Head of Bloomberg Economics, and Tony Travers, Director of the LSE in London, and also Ben Franklin, Director of Research and Policy for the CPP. Welcome to you all. Here they come. Do come. Thank you. All yours. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. I never know. Ben, why don't you take the NC? Everyone's too polite to actually sit down. But hello, everyone, and welcome to all of you who are joining us online via YouTube. You're most welcome. And we are here to discuss fiscal policy in an age of economic shock. So brace yourselves. The running order, I'm going to introduce the panel in just a moment. The running order is very similar to the earlier sessions. We're very pleased to have opening remarks first by Stephanie to my right. And then we will hear responses and additional comments from the rest of the panel. You can see there Tony and Ben, and then there will be 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. For those of you who are joining us online, I think all of you know the drill these days, but I think if you're in the room as well and you can manage to get on Wi-Fi, the hashtag is IGConf22. In fact, don't take my word for it. Just look for the Twitter handle for CPP. So I'm Linda Yueh. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I was actually appearing before the Treasury Committee yesterday on the autumn statement. So today should be a more relaxed affair. So what we're going to do is address a few questions in this session. We are going to take a look at what does credibility in fiscal policy look like in an era of multiple global economic shocks? Then we'll also take a look at the impact of public sector cuts on local and national government to finance some of our big economic and social challenges. We're talking health, demography, net zero. And what can we do to leverage private sector investment to try and help us achieve some of these goals? And then, if we have time, what are the fiscal rules we need if green, inclusive economic growth is our core economic policy objective? So I've got a great panel to answer all those questions and anything else you want to throw at them. So Stephanie Flanders, who'll be very familiar, I'm sure, to all of you. She's the Senior Executive Editor for Government and Economics and Head of Bloomberg Economics. To her right is Tony Travers. He's Director of LSE London, a research center at the London School of Economics, and he is a professor in the Government Department and Associate Dean of the School of Public Policy there. And then to his right is Ben Franklin, who's really of the home team. He's Director of Research and Policy here at CPP. So with that, we will kick off. Stephanie, I'm really delighted to hear opening remarks from you.
Thanks, Linda. And I think, if we have any gaps, we will also need to refer to you and what you said in your testimony, which may have been more coherent than certainly what I have to offer. But I had very sort of polite suggestions in my briefing pack about what I might choose to talk about, because Charlotte always likes to make sure she knows what people are going to say. But I think my brief is kind of a bit more on the macroeconomic, which is good because that probably plays to what I spend most of my time thinking about at Bloomberg. What is fiscal credibility, I guess, and what is not fiscal credibility, discuss with reference to the last few weeks. But I think also sort of more broadly, how bad is it looking What do I think about the sort of trade-offs that were struck in the most recent autumn statement, and how's that set us up for broader conversations about levelling up or net zero, any of the things that Linda just mentioned. So let me just talk very briefly. What does credibility look like? Well, obviously we can compare and contrast the two fiscal events of the past 2 months, but I don't want to rake over the Truss weeks too much. We've all kind of heard about that a lot, but I do think there's sort of fundamentally 3 elements that any fiscal statement or fiscal package in this environment would need to have met, and that would have been the same whether it was Liz Truss or anybody else. The first is, are you dealing with the squeeze, the enormous cost of living squeeze on households coming from the energy price rise and other inflation in a way that recognises the tensions between that and taming inflation itself? There's a basic conflict. The fact, people talk about, we have Bank of England, the government pulling in different directions. Pretty much every developed economy government has that problem at the moment. It was not unique to the UK. So are you sort of looking at seriously recognising that tension? Are you also, as we see the cost of borrowing go up globally from record lows that we all thought were exceptional until they carried on for years on end, are you preparing for a time when it's going to be more challenging, or at least less ridiculously easy, to finance government borrowing? That, again, is something that all countries would have been needing to do right now. And I guess the third, and the sort of one that always goes with the territory, but particularly interesting in the latter, or at least the later period of government for a single party, is can you bring your party with you? And that's been a more interesting challenge in the last few years with Brexit and everything else than it maybe has been in the past for many governments. And it's worth saying that both Boris and Rishi Sunak as Chancellor had already tested the limits of some of those things. So even the health and social care levy and some of the tax rises, the corporation tax increases, the things that Rishi Sunak had already done to try and sort of prepare the way for a more sustainable future, had been quite challenging in Parliament. And in many ways, Boris Johnson in some ways had used up a lot of his political capital to get, for example, the health and social levy passed. So some of these limits were already being felt. And of course, Boris was not always someone who enjoyed limits, but they were there anyway. I should also say there is a basic reality for the UK, which is not the case, for example, for the US, which is the world has just got more expensive with this energy price rise. And there's no way round that. We import a lot of our energy and indeed a lot of our food, and the price of those things has gone up. So again, any government would have been looking at a quite tough hand. As we know, the Truss-Quateng dynamic duo failed on all of those fronts. I don't think we have to kind of belabor it, but I think she was unlucky, but I think the two of them showed remarkable kind of hubris and a pig-headed obstinacy in the face of awkward facts like the ones I was just talking about. So in some ways, from a sort of objective sense, if you were looking at matching the individuals with the time, you couldn't really think of a worse fit, probably. But we've all moved on. I think the autumn statement, again, just sort of judging it on those 3 tests, I think it did provide more than we expected in the way of help for households and the poorest. In fact, it was, as many people have commented, an expansion in fiscal policy for the next year, injecting probably an extra 1% of GDP support for the economy, which wasn't there before. I should say there's a sort of bad news that comes with that when you talk about the trade-offs with supporting households and reducing inflation. We think we've sort of added 0.5 percentage point to the peak level of interest rates in terms of the official rate as a direct result of that generosity from Jeremy Hunt. The Bank of England has made clear in what it's previously said about various fiscal packages that it will be that will affect when it thinks it's done enough for interest rates. So it doesn't come free, that extra support in the short run. It's also, this package has done a little bit more of the recognising of the tensions, though, in targeting support better than previous packages had done, both on the energy and in other areas, obviously with the benefit uprating and other things. Still not fantastic, but 2/3 of the energy support next year will go to the poorest half of households, which I think it was only about half before, so it's a bit better. And they have focused, when you think about trying to minimise the damage to the economy of the tax rising measures, which some of which do kick in the next year or two, they have focused on things that will have the least effect on demand. So not public investment, which many people would have worried about because that's politically easier. They've generally focused on taxes on profits and rich people. Not very richest have done slightly less badly, but certainly people at the higher end. About 70% of the new taxes for individuals that were announced are on the richest top 20%. So they've done a better job, I think, probably better than expected, of balancing some of those tensions, in that sense being credible. Have they prepared for that sort of tougher financing climate? Well, it's sort of. If you look at the cuts, the sort of squeeze that comes in after this next year, you're looking at, after that sort of 1% expansion, you're looking at roughly an incremental 0.5 percentage point of GDP for the next few years after that, rising over 5 years to a 40 billion or 38 billion a year squeeze. Now, quite a few people have drawn the comparison with the George Osborne's 2010 package of cuts, or plan, 5-year plan, austerity plan, which was 40 billion, interestingly, so it seems like it's similar. But the thing you forget is that George Osborne was inheriting what Alistair Darling had already put into the plans a few months earlier, when you had that summer kind of emergency budget in 2010, which was 73 billion. So actually, this is quite modest relative to the sort of what we consider to be austerity years. And I think it's worth remembering that. Over 5 years, it goes to about 1% of GDP, whereas with the austerity was actually a 6 percentage point squeeze in the end. So that is, I think it's good to put, all the things that we say about how it's much harder to find cuts now than it was then, all of that's true, but you actually, at least on this plan, you're not trying to do nearly as much as George Osborne was. Whether he carries his party with him, who the hell knows? I think he does seem to be looking a bit more to Labour than to his own backbench, but we're not going to get too much into politics. I will just say, to get us into the broader conversation, which I hope we can discuss how inclusive growth can continue to be part of the debate. I fear that the next couple of years are instead going to be dominated by the sheer weak state of the economy, which is going to be smaller at the end of the Parliament than the beginning, for I think Resolution Foundation pointed out for the first time in 40 years. When you just look at the latest GDP numbers, the only part of spending, category of spending, which is currently higher than it was 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, was government spending. Household consumption, investment, exports are all still smaller. And the economy as a whole is still smaller, which, as we know, is different from other major economies. I think we'll also, as well as being focused on the weak state of the economy and this quite long recession we're forecasting, the risk is we will also have repeated bouts of question marks in the international markets about the UK's creditworthiness. We're not going to discuss, I suspect, the UK's other deficit today. Well, maybe we will, because you were talking about trade. But we have a twin deficit at the moment. If you take our current account deficit, what we're borrowing from the rest of the world, and what the government is borrowing, it's 12% of GDP, which is sort of is emerging market economy type level. And a lot of people, I was just in Asia last week, a lot of investors are still looking at the UK and saying, well, it's fine, the autumn statement's fine, but how is Britain actually going to borrow all this in a continuing basis? And that is a dangerous situation to have. You know, we're not going to go bankrupt. We can't go bankrupt because we've got our own pound, but we can have a lot of question marks in the markets, and we can certainly have another slump in the pound. So that, I think, could be a distraction. I think the other thing, which was already came up in the previous conversation, is there is an increasingly widespread understanding that Brexit has been more damaging than even many of the most concerned Remainers might have feared, and peculiarly ill-timed. You know, it's just not a great time to be trying to be global Britain, as it turns out, when the world is actually potentially decoupling and turning into much more kind of segregated trading blocks. My worry, though, is it's all very, you know, for those people who warned about Brexit, it's gratifying. It's very interesting that people are now not only saying they would vote differently if they had the vote again, they're even saying for the first time they would like to vote again. You know, we have had quite a long time a majority of people saying, I think I made a mistake, but when you ask them, do you want another referendum, they say, God, no. That's actually changed. But all of that is a massive distraction because the EU would not even consider having us in. I think they would have big questions about us rejoining the single market, let alone anything else, because they don't think it's a settled issue here, and they think we're not reliable partners now. So I fear, however, justifying for people who might have had doubts, it will be a distraction. Couple of positive things. I think we're starting to have, even just this week, a little bit more of a realistic debate about skills and immigration, tiny bit more. And I do actually also think the crisis in Ukraine, where support for Ukraine has held up remarkably well despite what's happened to energy prices, I think has also kind of reminded everybody of our continued close reliance on Europe and ties to Europe in a way that I think is helpful, along with all the bad things that have come. And maybe the current occupants of number 10 and number 11 have a slightly more coherent idea of what a levelling up strategy might be or what it might not be. This is to be debated. But if I was looking for positives, I think you have a little bit more realism about where the jobs are likely to come from, where the growth is likely to come from in the sort of held back parts of the UK than, say, Boris Johnson did. But all of that is to be discussed.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Great opening. I'm now going to hand over to Tony, who will be very familiar to those of you if you're looking for the best person to be looking at some of this impact locally and on London and broadly speaking, it'd be Tony.
Too kind. It can only go downhill from here. Thank you. So I just want to respond to one or two things Stephanie said and add some thoughts of my own, particularly about the way in which this all plays out locally. Now, to be a bit counter-cultural, I want to say something nice about Liz Truss. Because Liz Truss did articulate very clearly, in a way that nobody gone quite as far, and indeed quite as fast, that the trend growth rate in the UK, which has sort of tottered down to 1.5% or 1%, probably wasn't good enough to sustain the sort of state that we've become used to at 2.5% trend growth. So I think, at that level, and some of the so-called supply-side reforms that she was looking at, and Kwasi Kwarteng was looking at, they were kind of on the money. And the real risk is, as others have observed, that somehow they've discredited all sorts of the things that they were looking at that were good because of the general way the whole thing went down from the start, failed from the start. Intriguingly, Stephanie will be able to explain this to me, I noticed that the Office for Budget Responsibility, in its document published last week, alongside the autumn statement, shows growth going to 2.5% in 2024 and 2025, which suggests that they think miraculously trend growth is going to return, or perhaps it's a sort of bounce back effect after the dismal performance of the last 2 or 3 years. But anyway, I think that the long-term growth issue is one that it is worth us all dwelling on. And, for all their faults, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng got there, admittedly not in the right way. So, what I want now to do is just to turn all of this to look at the local level where most growth occurs, or where so much of the levelling up and related agenda is really about places and the people who live in places and their need for a better economy and one that works better for them. So therefore I want to look at, if you go forward and look at the way public spending is going to go for local areas, and it's true it's been held cash for the coming 2 years, so it was sort of the same numbers in cash that were determined in the spending review last year, but of course, inflation will have eroded that. But out beyond that, as the Resolution Foundation have already shown, for the unprotected services and local government and the kind of things that we're interested in this room are always unprotected, because the NHS, welfare, education as a total, now defence, they all have to be protected. And that means if public spending is to be constrained, everything else will have to return to some form of austerity. Everything else, I'm afraid, includes skills and FE. Now, the number of conferences devoted over the decades to why further education is a Cinderella service and needs to be loved. In fact, all post-school non-university education falls in this category. But there's no question it's not in the protected group, and so it will be cut. It's still spending less than it was in 2010, and it will be cut more. Infrastructure, somebody said big infrastructure is protected, but I doubt local and smaller infrastructure will be protected in this world as we move forward. And then last but not least, the money that local authorities don't get through all the little levelling up grants, not all of them are little at the local level, but many of them are. But the underlying money they have to spend on the services that make their areas attractive to be in is going to be cut further. It's already way down on where it was in 2010. So as you walk outside your front door every morning, your local authority has less money to spend on the streets, the lighting, high streets, all of that, because it's been cut substantially. None of these services are loved, and they will all be cut further in the years ahead, he said rather bleakly. So the question is, will the large number of little funding pots that councils are given or local areas are given, or sometimes combined authorities are given, to improve inclusive local green growth, will they be enough? And I suspect the answer is not. There are far too many of these little funding pots being handed out at the local level. They take an enormous amount of time and effort to bid for. And in the end, every single one of them comes down to civil servants and ministers in Whitehall knowing what's best for Carlisle, or knowing what's best for Leeds, or knowing what's best for Camden, or wherever it is. And that, I'm afraid, is not a sustainable model that's likely to produce local growth of the kind that is needed in many parts of the country. So, where does this take us? Well, I think it takes us back to the supply side reforms that seem to have disappeared. So I do think, and Stephanie referred to this, that the government certainly has begun to talk a little bit about planning reforms, a little bit, they're very difficult, a little bit about the migration policy that they've inherited. And in that area lies, I suspect, some of the places where there is local freedom to help generate growth. But for the moment, it's all work in progress. And I think one of the most intriguing consequences of the turmoil of the last few years, apart from the economic turmoil, is how little space it's given politicians to think policy. Virtually no policy. They just don't have the time. To be fair to Michael Gove, he did manage to get out a white paper on levelling up, a major achievement given all else that's going on. Not much of the rest of the government is able to do that. So I think that as we look forward, if we're going to get better and more inclusive growth at the local level, it's going to require greater local freedom to use the resources and powers available at the subnational level, obviously with resources in some cases coming from the national level, in order to produce the kind of growth in places that have been left behind, to help them catch up. And as I say, that needs policy, and it needs it not just for 2 or 3 years, but for 30. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And that's a really nice segue to Ben, who is going to look ahead, not 5 years or 10 years. He's going to look over decades to look at the long run changes that we might want to pay some attention to, the impact on fiscal policy of some of our trends that I mentioned at the start. And I actually think I'm also American, and so Benjamin Franklin, of course.
I blame my parents for a lot.
Did that for America. Very long-term planning. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Linda, and delighted to be Lord Woolney. Although for the eagle-eyed amongst you, I'm the stand-in today. I'm not going to talk about business investment as he was going to. I'm going to talk about the long run, and specifically around the 50-year mark as well. So cast your minds back to before Liz Truss, if you can, try and do that. And there was a document published by the Office for Budget Responsibility that looks much long-term than their economic and fiscal outlooks. So for the geeks amongst us, that's their Fiscal Sustainability and Fiscal Risks report. Do have a look at that, because it's really important. That doesn't look 5 years, that looks up to 2070. And what you'll see there in terms of the trends going forward is a substantial rise in our debt to GDP. What causes that, and what, in terms of the OBR, puts us on an unsustainable path? Well, it's our healthcare spend, continuing to take up an increasing proportion of our day-to-day government spending. And that's not just driven by demographics, as we have an aging population, it's also driven by innovation in healthcare, but particularly in treatment. And that's one of the biggest issues. Now, we do also talk about pension spending as well a lot, and how that might be unsustainable. But in the OBR's forecast, at least, over the long run, it's dwarfed, absolutely dwarfed, by healthcare expenditure. And yet, if we look at the last decade, our health is massively stagnating despite more investment in the NHS. In fact, I could flippantly say we're becoming a healthcare state. Now, that's slightly different for local government, which is increasingly a social care entity, as lots of their other services have been stripped apart. But effectively, the state is increasingly focusing on treatment rather than prevention and underlying causes, and I think that's a really important part. Another thing worth stressing, which I think we mentioned earlier, but it's also worth factoring in that the OBR thinks we're going to have 1.5% productivity growth over the next 4 decades. Now, to me, having seen what's happened over the last 20 years, that seems incredibly optimistic. I hope that they're right, but 1.5% looks like the absolute optimum that you can potentially achieve given where we sit today, barring some brilliant innovation, which hopefully comes, but we can't necessarily count on that. So the OBR's headline for the Fiscal Sustainability Report, this is before Liz Truss, is that we're on an unsustainable path. So that's something to bear in mind. What can we do about all of this? I mean, that is a huge challenge, and it has to be a cross-party challenge. But, you know, from a CPP point of view, it's about getting more public investment in prevention, and particularly human capital. It is skills that we really are interested in. It is education. It is health rather than healthcare that are the key determinants of our future success. It is childcare, for example, and Charlotte mentioned our work on childcare this morning, not just for the development of children, but also to enable mums in particular, but also dads, to work the hours that they want and have better efficient allocation of labour, which has significant productivity benefits. It's also about local areas and releasing the potential of local areas, and we'll talk a bit more about that, and Tony's already mentioned some of that. But what does this mean in terms of how we pay for it? And we're obviously going to have a huge amount of debate as we run up to the next election about how we pay for public services. And the autumn statement at least acknowledged that we are going to have higher taxes in the short term. Well, we're going to have higher taxes probably over the medium to long run too. But that means that taxes are going to have to reorient from where they are now, which focuses particularly on incomes of those at work. But obviously, those of the working age population are going to stagnate and ultimately shrink. So that doesn't seem like a particularly efficient or sustainable way of doing things. So we are going to have to think about pensioner incomes. We are going to have to think about wealth more in terms of taxation. And also we're going to have to think about how we distribute those tax and revenue powers. Is it that the national government should be doing that, or should that be done more locally? We are one of the most centralised countries across the developed world. Migration and trade are also important determinants of our long run And they seem to both be political non-starters. I agree, Stephanie, there's been a few bits of optimism recently, but, we are still a bit in gutter politics about migration at the moment. It seems to be an either or. Either we have high productivity country or we have a high migration country. That's a very simplistic view of the world around us, and actually migration does contribute to productivity growth in the long run too. And there is credible research that shows that the tax revenue take from particularly EU migrants is higher than the amount that's spent too. Fiscal rules, I think we might go on to that a little bit, and hopefully we get some questions around that. Fiscal rules are useful up to a point, but governments have disbanded their fiscal rules many, many, many times. There's a wonderful chart, there's a wonderful IMF chart that shows all the fiscal rules that all countries of the world have. They've all been disbanded. So the most important thing is don't be hamstrung by them, and make sure you have some credible numbers. And that's really where Truss came unstuck. One shout out for George Osborne, which is going to surprise my colleagues, I think. But it's about the OBR. He set up the OBR, and that is actually a great thing. It's transparent. You can disagree with the forecast, but it's incredibly transparent. You can see all of the underlying assumptions. And to go against the OBR, I think, was probably the fatal mistake that Truss and Kwarteng made. And it looked like, as a result, that it was back of the fag packet stuff. So, in all this, I think let's not forget the long run, and let's think about how we can regenerate more human capital with our public spending and not just become a healthcare state. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Stephanie, why don't I bring you back in?
Yeah, I'm just going to sort of two things in response to, or one each. The sort of quick answer to Tony about the growth is, I'm afraid it is all catch up.
It's a bounce.
So it's and I was just confirming this, I was looking, but the trend rate of growth assumption has not changed since their last statement. I think it's 1.7 a year. But there are several years, because the next few years are so bad, we then have a slightly better few years after that. But it's worth also saying that you can draw a chart. I mean, our average growth rate had been remarkably, and this was true of many developed economies, through the 20th century, actually. We'd had a remarkably consistent trend rate of growth, around 2.25%. Literally since the early 1900s, and there's a disconnect after the global financial crisis, which happened to lots of countries, but much more dramatically for us. And it's kind of extraordinary because you see, we bounced around. We had lots of recessions and everything else, but we always went back to that trend until 2008. So that was the answer to that. I would push back a bit on I think one thing that's worth discussing, because is whether or not the Office for Budget Responsibility now has too much power. Because I think when George Osborne, I remember actually when I was at the BBC when George Osborne created the Office of Budget Responsibility, and I thought at the time it was a very shrewd political thing to do, because so much of the opprobrium that descends on chancellors are to do with wrong forecasts. And to have all of that diverted to the Office of Budget Responsibility seemed to me very smart. I think I even had a mixed metaphor which for once worked, about having have a rod on his back which is also conducting lightning on his behalf, which the BBC editors had a long time deciding whether or not you could use that particular mixed metaphor. But I was very proud of it, and you see, I still remember it. I was so proud of it. But I think it's actually extended. It had a fairly narrow technocratic brief, where it was supposed to be just literally taking with some back and forth, taking the numbers from the Treasury and then spelling out what they meant. It has become, as we've heard through lots of leaks over the last few weeks, a much more two-sided dialogue, where the Office of Budget Responsibility's potentially quite random assessments on things, we were talking earlier about forecast always being wrong, having an enormous weight on socially and politically important policy. Now, there may be no way around that, because the Treasury was pretty useless at it, but the Treasury was at least a bit more politically accountable and directly responsible. So I would just raise that. It has been a fantastic institution. We probably do need an independent fiscal estimate, but both the OBR and potentially fiscal rules have ended up kind of wagging the dog in a way that may be a bit unhelpful in the future. Discuss.
Thank you. We're going to...
Just to add, it's an intriguing thesis, which I can see exactly what you mean. The other thing I'd add is because they've become it and the bank have latterly had such a high-profile role, they've been dragged into politics, and they're now in the political arena with senior members of the government, or ex-members of the government in one case, openly saying they get all their forecasts wrong. Necromancy, I think was the word. And so they've been dragged into politics as well. The bank, I think, is particularly shocking in some ways that that they're now tied up in the political system rather than standing free, as I think both Gordon Brown on the one hand and George Osborne on the other was hoping it would turn out.
But if you put them in charge of really important stuff, then they have to be politically involved.
Of course.
Just one comeback on that as well is obviously the fiscal rules are decided by government rather than the OBR. And it says the OBR to say whether the government are meeting its own fiscal rules. Government doesn't have to have a particularly stringent fiscal rule. They can give themselves more flexibility, potentially.
That's true.
We're going to open this up in about 10 minutes or so get your questions ready. And again, if you're watching online, feel free to submit your question using the hashtag IGConf22, and the Twitter handle is CenterProPolicy if you want to take a look at that. And I'll try to come to some online questions as well. But before we do that, I just want to probe a little bit about essentially, I'll start with you, Ben, because you highlighted it. After the autumn statement, taxes are now going to be around over 37% of GDP, which is the highest that it's been for since modern records began. And yet, we heard from Tony, there's going to be lots of public spending cuts, which is right, because after 2025, you start to get only a 1% increase, which means a real term cut in unprotected departments. So over the longer term, how should we manage increased demands on spending because of all the reasons that you've highlighted? What kind of changes do we need to see on the tax side? Are you talking a higher tax level? Are you, are we talking France? Are we talking Denmark? How does this? And if you want to give any suggestions for other countries, that'd be really helpful as well. I think it was put to me as how do we get Scandinavian levels of benefits with Singaporean efficiency?
Yeah, which is nonsense. It's not achievable, unfortunately. I am a bit sceptical about the post-2025 spending cuts. Clearly they were all put into a post-election reality, which we may never see, and the level of those cuts, given where public services are currently, I don't think we can get to that. Unfortunately, we are in a place where we have had our public services effectively gutted out. The 6% figure that you said, Stephanie, earlier is kind of astonishing, and it has left us bare bones, and local government has been absolutely bearing the forefront of that. And a lot of the problems that healthcare is facing is actually because local government expenditure has been cut, because it's such an important in terms of addressing some of the wider determinants of health. I think wealth has to be part of the equation. So you're right, obviously 37% of GDP is higher than we've ever been. We're still not as high as some Scandinavian countries, although they do obviously have better public services. However, this is going to be a long-term thing. We need to continue to reinforce our public services year on year. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're still too focused on the treatment rather than the prevention, and that speaks to a public service reform agenda to some extent. So maybe we can do more with the money that we currently have, but we are going to have to spend more and tax more, and that's why I think forms of wealth taxes, and there are some ideas that are better than others, is something we have to try and think about, as well as how we tax pensioner incomes a bit more as well in future.
Tony.
Well, it is an old favourite, which I've always used myself a lot. What the people of Britain want is to have Sweden's public services with America's taxes. We're perilously close heading to getting America's levels of public services with Sweden's taxes, which is not, I think, what most people wanted. So I think the challenge, which Ben has outlined, Stephanie talked about too, that in a sense that politicians are always assuming their successors will sort this all out. So health spending today is over 20% higher in real terms than it was in 2010. Local government spending is 20% lower in real terms than it was in 2010. Now, you can go on doing that and go on and doing it. But eventually, somebody at some point is going to have to address this problem, either with substantially higher taxes, even than we're getting now, or with fairly radical public service reform of a kind that pretty well all governments since the Blair government haven't really, perhaps a bit of Francis Maud, but really found very, very difficult. And if you look at the struggle over the health service, it's almost impossible to get near it to reform it. And that is, and if you add that to the growth of the welfare budget, 10% all round, we do risk becoming a welfare state with nuclear weapons and not much else, and that can't happen.
Thank you. Stephanie.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think we all know it's difficult. And I share some of Tony's concerns. I guess if we're just looking for ways for pieces of it to take on, Ben mentioned a very important thing, pensioners' incomes, and indeed looking again at the land taxes and wealth taxes. I think that is a chunk of it. And as was mentioned in the earlier session, it is quite striking when you compare our long-term pension liabilities, state pension liabilities, to other countries. That is one thing, for better or worse, that was addressed actually in the Thatcher years, putting us on a very long-term lower path than other countries. So I think there's a chunk around how a new contract with the retired population, and of course the retired will be older than we may have than in past times. And another chunk of it, which I think we are starting to be a bit more grown up about, though of course we should have done it 10 or 20 years ago. We know we want to spend more on prevention, on the preventive side of health, as Ben has said. And we know that it gets ruinously expensive if you're only taking people at A&E, and if you're unable to find people's homes in social care, so they're blocking beds. I think just that big chunk, that big problem, I think we're starting to think through ways where you might be able to, combining with Tony's, my sort of favoured now kind of penchant for having a bit more decentralisation. Some of the deals that were done with Manchester over social care, where they can potentially explicitly trade off different parts of the health budget against social care priorities. Jeremy Hunt actually understands that. He wasn't always very popular within the health service, but he understands some of those trade-offs better than most, and I think that was reflected actually in the autumn statement. So I would just say we can't solve it all. We do have a problem. I'm sure taxes will be higher in the end, and public services will be worse than we would like. But those two pieces, I think one government could try and find a sort of multi-party, decentralised way through.
Thank you. And before we open it up, one more round of questions just for me, which is we talked about fiscal rules, and you have to remind yourself what the fiscal rule currently is, because it has changed quite a lot. It is now deficit below 3% of GDP, which is not dissimilar to the Maastricht treaties for the EU, and debt falling as a share of GDP on a rolling 5-year basis. I think it's the rolling part was the key word there. But I suppose if I went around this panel and said, despite the fact that rules have changed quite a lot, and I know, Stephanie, you've already mentioned this, is it better to have fiscal rules or not have them? Stephanie, I think you...
I think that, in effect, and I'm sorry to be saying this from the sort of Bloomberg side, but I think if you don't have some kind of rule, it only needs to be maybe one rule, that debt should be declining over some time frame as a share of GDP. But that is a rule which the world will impose on you if you don't have it yourself. So I think just that one is sort of handy. And it's interesting, actually, that as you know, Linda, the Europeans are now moving towards having that much more simple framework for their fiscal rules, rather than having to sort of pretend that they're meeting the other ones when they're not. So yes, you need some kind of, and I think some version, it's funny that although we've had endless combinations all over the world, some version of the golden rule, borrowing only to invest, I think also is quite a helpful guiding principle. I think it's a shame that it's been so discredited over the years, the idea of having a broader version of investment. And to include some of that training and skills and all of those things, because I think that would be helpful in that context. But in some sense, borrowing only to invest and having debt fall as a share of GDP is just it's a useful frame of reference.
Yeah, so that rule is no longer in the current rule.
But definitions of the fiscal whole and all that, I think we can just end up fetishizing.
Yeah. Now, the current fiscal rule does not distinguish between current and capital spending, doesn't distinguish between day-to-day and capital investment. And so the borrowing to invest rule is no longer there. But as we said, these things are malleable. May well come back by the spring.
I guarantee you the Treasury will find some way to bring it back.
Tony?
And I think in some ways governments, I mean, if you think back through a longer period, governments have chosen indicators, money supply, the balance of payments. They've varied over time. And I think they're a way of allowing the government to express, even to its own side to some degree, what it's trying to do. It's just a way of understanding it that's a bit simpler than all that stuff in all those red books, So, but personally, I think I'd add to these rules, try not to print too much more money. That would be a personal thought. I think the printing thing has not helped much, but I'm not an economist, so it just seems a bit out of control.
Thank you, Tony. Ben?
Wouldn't we have to get rid of central bank independence in that case, though?
Probably. I'm not an economist.
Well, maybe we should. But I think there's a question about whether debt needs to fall as a proportion of GDP or remain stable, and whether that provides you with a bit more flexibility to do some of the borrowing to investment, which isn't technically capital spending, but is skills and human capital. So there are questions around all of that. Definitely, I think that the kind of golden rule, having capital spending excluded from that, is a great idea. There is still an open question about, well, how then do you include skills and human capital, which we're talking about? I don't know the answer to that because we're based on international accounting rules. So, but maybe there's some sort of clever fix you can do, I'm not sure. Or maybe it's actually just about the quality of the argument that you make politically. But I haven't much more to add than that.
So fiscal rules, yes. Yeah. Okay.
Something.
However imperfect.
Something.
I guess with a small f and a small r rather than the fiscal rule.
Something to at least pretend that you're credible in terms of your spending.
And that is the point of this session, credibility of fiscal rules. Fantastic. I do want to open it up to the audience. So I see a huge number of hands. I am going to, okay, so if those of you who want to ask a question, raise your hand so I can just spot you. Okay. All right, this is, there is somebody with a microphone who would just make the decision for me. So this is I think if we go to, take one from the very back, and then we'll go to this section, then we'll go to this section. If you could introduce yourself, please. Keep your question short, and I'll have one panelist answer, just so we can get through as many questions as we can, because there's so many of you who want to chip in on this important debate. Thank you for being interested in fiscal rules, by the way, in fiscal policy. Please.
Andrew Keckwick, voter. Why are other Northwest European countries much more successful at producing a higher skilled workforce?
Oh, that's a great question. Who wants to take that? Ben?
I think they've actually invested in skills. I think it's quite simple in that sense. I think there's also maybe a structural thing with our economy that we are so services orientated. Maybe if we still had a manufacturing base that we did in the 60s and 70s, then we'd think differently about vocational and skilled education. There are still parts of the country where manufacturing is still a prominent part, and it should absolutely feature in terms of our thinking on human capital and our investment.
Yeah, thank you. Question here.
Jim Cantor, I'm with the charity Minority Inclusion. My question was, rather than cherry picking bits of the US and European economies, what does the panel think about the UK looking more towards a Japanese type of economy?
Great, thank you. Stephanie, do you want to take that? You've just been to Asia, broad generalization there.
Yeah, different parts of Asia are quite different. I mean, the one answer is we have actually, certainly as we know, where we have got great skills and productivity has been when we've got foreigners to run our car factories, for example, and the Nissan factory at least did in Sunderland produce more cars than Italy. Where it's been certainly importing Japanese techniques has worked in some areas. I think we may be about to test this, but the Japanese social cohesion. You know, it sounds sort of caricature, but it is an extraordinary cohesive society, quite racially homogeneous, a lot more homogeneous than ours. It has got a very different approach to working life, where you expect to have a single job for life even now, and extremely high technical prowess in key areas which are actually not necessarily the kind of areas that we've been good at, particularly robotics. So I just think we sort of have to pick something realistic. You know, it's just a very different model, and specifically actually in terms of it's relatively closed, both economically and politically. It just doesn't seem like the obvious place. I mean, going back to the first question, the answer to this has always got to be more like Germany, and the reason the Northern European countries are better at skills is they're more like Germany than we are, and we sort of sporadically decide we have to be more German in our approach to skills. But I think just picking another, we've learned some things from the Japanese, but I think we have to be a bit careful about that.
Okay, so, a question in this block?
I'm David Clark. I'm a freelance policy consultant. I'm wondering what you think is specifically the lesson to take away from what happened with the Truss government. Jeremy Hunt might say it's like they were insufficiently focused on bringing down the debt to GDP ratio. You could also say like maybe it's kind of fine to focus more on promoting growth, but it just wasn't a very good plan. Like cutting taxes isn't a very good plan for how to do that. But then there's also the other argument, like that people like Mark Carney have been putting forwards, which is that it's like you can have a kind of more flexible approach, but you've got to be respectful towards institutions and like not slag off the Bank of England or like ignore the OBR, like you've been mentioning. So yeah.
I actually arrived in Washington, D.C. for the IMF World Bank annual meetings. And the UK was the talk of the town. It's not good to be the talk of the town, I have to say, at those meetings.
And the butt of a lot of jokes, actually, same week, yeah.
Yeah, I'm also American, so I think I might have sounded a bit more American that week. Tony.
I think we're in the Royal Institution here, after all. Lots is discussed about science here, and there are basic laws of science, like gravity. If it's a law, then you know what I mean. But the point is, I think that you can't defy in government and policy, as in science, certain basic laws. And Stephanie made the point early on, I completely agree with this, that the UK operates as a medium-sized economy in a global system, but we know about financial markets. Harold Wilson used to rail against them. It's not as if it's new. So I think the main lesson is to understand the environment globally and within the country that the politicians are operating in, and then to pre-signal what you're doing so they understand it and see what they think. None of that happened. They just assumed they could be disruptive, and they could assume that without pre-signaling we'd all excite everybody into growth. Well, it didn't. That would be my short, sharp thought.
Thank you, Tony. I mean, I think Keir Starmer gave a speech, or he's giving a speech today, and I think he's also focused on try to generate growth. It was actually a theme that I mentioned yesterday. I appeared before the Treasury Committee. So I think ultimately, in skills, all the things we're describing, you still need to have an inclusive, greener, locally driven growth strategy. And I think the question is credibility, right? How it is that you end up doing that. And I think, we talked a lot about debt today, obviously. The debt to GDP ratio. We always focus on the numerator, but the denominator is hugely important. So if we could get back to pre-2008 growth rates, about 2.5% versus about a percentage point below that, I think that would do a great deal to help finance quite a lot of the things that we've discussed. So I think we have time probably just to squeeze in another question. Oh, there's, why don't we go to the back row over there? If you could. There's a guy in the back row up there as well. Okay, good. So, yeah, thank you. Please introduce yourself and if you pose your question.
Hi, I'm Nantisha Warnorak and I'm a student at King's College London. My question is about credibility. So, in recent years, Britain has done a lot of things that harms its credibility in the world stage, and I'm just wondering how can Britain build back its credibility? What does this government have to do to get that trust back on track again?
Thank you. Another great question, Stephanie.
I mean, actually, to be a little bit more optimistic, I think that the history of sort of the global financial history suggests that actually I'm going slightly against what people say. It's easy to lose credibility and hard to rebuild it. I actually think in the case of the UK, we've been given enormous scope to get into trouble over the years, and then have been, people, investors and others are once a country is perceived to have kind of ingrained, reasonably good institutions, rule of law, all these things that the UK used to be famous for. Yes, they have been undermined over the last few years. Some of the sort of guardrails have fallen away or been eroded. But I think redemption is potentially, just on your measure of sort of, are you basically credible? I think we're not as far away from that as you might think. And a good example of that is Argentina, which has defaulted, I don't know how many times on its debt, and was still able, not very long ago, to sell 100-year government bonds, which I don't think we've even done, I'm not sure. But and even at the time, you thought, that is mad. Who on earth is going to buy those? And of course, now they are facing severe financing problems. But I think we possibly overestimate how hard that particular bit will be.
I completely agree with that. I think, if you look at Britain's history, the concept of the sterling crisis has a literature. This is not something new. And I think if you look at the Suez crisis or the 1970s or back to the 1926 to 31 period, at the time it didn't look so great, and yet miraculously here we all still are. So of course there might be the final point where we don't get it right, but I do think that in the end there are self-writing mechanisms. And I think Rishi Sunak, to his credit, doesn't look to me like somebody who wants to break international law and get into trouble with the markets.
It has to be said, the pound is worth a hell of a lot less than it was during the Suez crisis. So there's also a downward trend.
There's a long downward trend.
Quick word from you, Ben. We literally have 10 seconds.
One thing I would say is don't be too hamstrung by credibility to such an extent that all you care about is financial stability and not actually how you generate the public services and growth that the country needs.
Yeah. James Carville, Bill Clinton's former advisor, used to say, he used to think, he said, when I'm reincarnated, I want to come back as, a president. He goes, now I want to come back as the bond market. But I do think, I think the final thoughts here are really important. We talked a lot about fiscal policy, global economic shocks. The UK has very long-standing institutions, a long history of paying back our debt and being credible. And I think, that is a nice thought to end on, because this has been a fascinating, stimulating, worrying session. But I think we also have taken away quite a few ideas for how we can make fiscal policy better in an era of global economic shocks. And we're able to do that because of this fantastic panel: Stephanie Flanders, Tony Travers, Ben Franklin. Please give them a huge round of applause. Thank you.
And Linda, thank you very much for chairing it.